In a dusty archive, a family portrait from 1889 seemed ordinary, until a closer look revealed something chilling. Behind the father and son stood a stranger no one remembered, and his face was staring straight at the viewer. The box looked unremarkable at first glance. Plain, dust-coated wood, its lid barely hanging on the hinges. Elias Warren slid it across the long oak table of the Blackridge Historical Archive, the scraping sound echoing faintly in the quiet hall. The smell of mildew and paper filled the air, the scent of every forgotten object he had catalogued over the years. He pushed his glasses higher on the bridge of his nose and pried the lid open with careful fingers, not wanting to damage what might be inside. Stacks of documents greeted him, brittle contracts, yellowed receipts, handwritten letters that had turned fragile at the edges. He lifted each one with the trained patience of an archivist, laying them neatly in piles. Then, tucked beneath a folded sheet of canvas, he found something that made his breath still. A portrait. The frame was wrapped in crumbling paper, secured with string that snapped at his touch. He unwrapped it slowly, dust rising in the lamplight as though the object had been sleeping for more than a century. The glass caught the glow, and beneath it 2 figures emerged, a father and his son. They stood stiffly, as was common in photographs of the late 1800s. The man wore a dark waistcoat, his shoulders squared with authority, though his eyes seemed strained, as though holding a truth he did not want revealed. The boy, no older than 10, wore a small jacket with brass buttons, his hands tucked rigidly at his sides. His lips looked pressed tight, not with a child's innocence, but with discomfort, like he'd been told to stay still, no matter how badly he wanted to move. Elias leaned closer, elbows resting on the table. Something about the portrait unsettled him. It wasn't unusual to find old family images in donations, but this one resisted the casual glance. It demanded study. Adjusting the lamp, he tilted the frame slightly, letting the light stretch across the glass. That was when he noticed it. At first he thought it was a flaw, a smudge maybe, or a trick of the old beveled glass. But when he squinted, the faint outline grew sharper. A third face. His heartbeat quickened. The reflection was blurred, not part of the portrait itself, but lingering within the glass. A man stood in the background, just beyond the father and son. His features weren't clear, but Elias could make out the hollow lines of a face, the curve of cheekbones, the empty sockets of eyes, fixed in a watchful stare. He swallowed, suddenly aware of the silence pressing in around him. "No," he muttered softly. "That can't be." He reached for the magnifying lens he kept in his coat pocket, set it against the glass, and inhaled sharply. It was unmistakable. A stranger, caught in the portrait where no one else was meant to be. The longer he stared, the more the figure seemed to press forward, as if trying to force his way through the boundary of glass. Elias sat back abruptly, the chair creaking beneath him. His fingers tapped nervously on the desk. He had handled thousands of artifacts, from Civil War maps to daguerreotypes of forgotten soldiers, but never had one left him with the sensation that he was being watched in return. The archive felt colder. Shadows in the corners of the high-ceilinged room seemed to stretch, leaning closer as though eager to listen. He turned the portrait over, hoping for an inscription, but the wooden backing was bare, save for a faint pencil mark. 1889. He rubbed his jaw. "Who are you?" he whispered, eyes flicking back to the hidden face. Later that evening, Elias carried the portrait into the staff lounge where Daniel, another archivist, was poring over an index of land deeds. Daniel was tall and broad, his presence steady, his humor often a needed balance against Elias's intensity. Elias set the portrait down with a deliberate motion. "Tell me what you see," Elias said. Daniel raised an eyebrow, leaned closer, and studied the photo. "A stiff old family portrait," he said after a beat. "Typical for the time. Father looks proud. Kid looks miserable. Nothing unusual there." Elias pointed to the beveled edge of the glass. "Look again, right there. Do you see it?" Daniel squinted, tilting his head. "What, that smudge?" He chuckled. "Probably double exposure. Cameras back then were tricky. Accidents happened all the time." Elias shook his head. "That's not a smudge, it's a face. Someone else is there." Daniel leaned back, crossing his arms with a dismissive shrug. "You've been working too many late nights. Your eyes are seeing patterns where there aren't any." But Elias wasn't laughing. He turned the portrait toward himself again, staring into the faint reflection. The man's outline refused to vanish. That night, long after Daniel had gone home, Elias remained in the archive. The fluorescent lights above hummed faintly, the only sound against the scratching of his pen as he dug through the donor records. The box had come from the estate of the Whitlock family, once a prominent name in Blackridge, though now reduced to scattered descendants who no longer lived in the area. He flipped through brittle papers until he uncovered a diary, its leather cover cracked, the pages stiff with age. It belonged to a woman. Her name was faded, her handwriting elegant but strained. Most entries were mundane, notes about the weather, about her son's health, about letters from relatives. But one line, tucked into the margin, stole Elias's breath. "They whisper of the man beneath the house, silenced in the stone cellar." The pen slipped from his hand, clattering against the table. His pulse thudded in his ears. He glanced back at the portrait. The father's eyes seemed harder now, the boy's lips more pressed, as if the photograph itself shifted with the knowledge he carried. And in the glass, the blurred face remained, waiting. Elias pressed his palms to the table, his voice barely a whisper. Silenced in the cellar. For the first time in years, his steady archivist's hands trembled. He knew accidents of photography could create strange illusions, but this was no illusion. It felt like evidence. He pushed back his chair and began pacing the length of the archive. The fluorescent lights flickered, humming louder, as though the building itself shared his unease. Each time he passed the portrait, he felt the hidden face draw his eyes, an invisible pull that tightened his chest. Who was this man? Why had he been trapped in the reflection of a family portrait? And why had a widow's diary hinted at a death beneath the Whitlock house? Elias stopped at the window, staring into the night beyond. His reflection looked back at him, pale, tired, his eyes wide with something between dread and resolve. He realized he couldn't leave this alone. The portrait wasn't just a curiosity. It was a key. Grabbing his notebook, he jotted down the name Whitlock Estate. His plan was already forming. He would go there himself. The cellar might still exist, buried beneath layers of dust and time. If the story in the diary was true, the answers to the portrait's mystery might lie waiting in that darkness. He returned to the table and carefully wrapped the portrait again. Though he could still feel its weight pressing through the paper, heavier than wood and glass had any right to be. As he locked the archive doors behind him, the night air met him like a cold breath. He paused on the steps, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. His fingers tightened around his notebook. The portrait had been silent for more than 100 years, but now it had chosen to speak. Elias knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, it had chosen him. His whisper broke the night silence, the words barely audible yet carrying the gravity of a vow. Whoever that man was, he wanted to be seen. The Whitlock estate rose out of the trees like a husk of its former self, a house that had once thrived on wealth, but now sagged into ruin. Elias stood at the rusted gate, the portrait wrapped under his arm, and stared at the shape of it in the distance. Its windows were blind with grime, the roof line uneven, shingles missing like teeth. Ivy strangled the walls, twisting up toward broken chimneys. The place seemed to breathe, not with life, but with memory. He forced the gate open, the hinges shrieking in protest. Gravel shifted beneath his shoes as he walked the overgrown path. No birds sang here, no wind dared stir the tall weeds. The silence clung thick, and with every step forward Elias felt as though the house itself was waiting for him. At the porch, boards sagged under his weight. The door opened with a slow, reluctant groan when he pushed it, releasing the stale scent of dust, mold, and something faintly metallic. He paused, sniffing. It reminded him of rust or blood. Inside, the floorboards wore a thick blanket of dust, disturbed only by tiny animal prints. His flashlight beam slid across a collapsed sofa, wallpaper peeling in long strips, a cracked mirror leaning crooked against the wall. Shadows seemed to lean back against the light, refusing to scatter. He moved deeper, the portrait pressed tight to his side, as if carrying it offered him protection. His boots echoed hollowly in the vast hallway. He traced the layout until he found the door he had been searching for. Narrow, wood swollen from years of damp, a handle tarnished to green. The cellar. Elias hesitated, fingers hovering above the iron latch. A prickle ran down his arms. His breath misted faintly, though the night outside was not cold enough for it. He forced the latch down. The door opened with a drawn-out moan, a sound that seemed to echo too long in the silence. Darkness yawned below, deep and waiting. One step, two. His flashlight beam wavered across stone walls as he descended the stairs. The air shifted, growing cooler, thick with the damp smell of earth. His hand trailed the wall instinctively, fingers brushing cold, wet stone. At the bottom, his light steadied on the walls themselves. The stones glistened faintly, as though they wept. He swung the beam slowly, and that was when he saw them. Scratches, jagged, uneven gouges etched into the stone surface. Not tools. No, they were too wild, too desperate. These had been made by fingernails, clawing, fighting for escape. The beam trembled as his hand began to shake. Elias's throat tightened, his chest hollow with dread. "Dear God," he whispered. He crouched closer, the smell of damp earth pressing into his nose. The marks covered the wall in frantic clusters, some shallow, others deep enough to have broken bone. The air grew heavier. He turned the light toward the far wall, where something protruded from the soil. He stepped forward, his heartbeat hammering, each footfall slow and deliberate. The beam found a rusted shovel, lying half buried in the dust. Beside it, the soil looked disturbed, turned, dug and poorly covered again. Elias lowered himself to his knees. His hand trembled as he brushed aside dirt. First, he uncovered a splintered wooden board, blackened with age. Then something white glimmered beneath the soil. He froze, his stomach twisting. With cautious fingertips he pulled more earth away until the curved fragment revealed itself fully. Bone. Human. Elias recoiled, stumbling backward, the flashlight beam jerking wildly across the walls. He clutched the portrait to his chest like a shield, his breath rasping shallow and fast. The cellar suddenly felt smaller, the ceiling lower, as though the air itself pressed down on him. He scrambled toward the stairs, boots scraping against stone. But he stopped halfway up, gripping the railing hard. If there were bones here, there must be more. This wasn't just a forgotten cellar. It was a grave. When he finally forced himself back into the upper floor, the air tasted fresher, though it carried the sour tang of rot. He set the portrait down on a dust-covered table and leaned against the wall, shaking. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but his hands betrayed him, prying open trunks and drawers left behind. In one trunk, beneath layers of rotted linen, he found letters bound by ribbon. The paper was brittle, ink-faded, but the words still legible. He spread them out, scanning. Most were simple notes between brothers, discussions of weather, crops, and money. But one letter stopped him cold. He knew too much. The cellar keeps its own silence. The words were underlined, the ink darker, as though the writer pressed harder, sealing the thought with grim intent. Elias's hand shook so badly the paper nearly tore. He whispered the words aloud, voice cracking in the empty room. The cellar keeps its own silence. He looked at the portrait again, resting on the table. The father's stern gaze seemed colder, the boy's forced stillness more painful. And behind them, blurred but unmistakable, that same stranger's face watched from the glass. Elias pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. Whoever the man was, he had been buried here, silenced by the Whitlocks, hidden for more than a century. Yet his reflection lingered, defying erasure. The silence of the house thickened, pressing in from all sides. Elias's ears strained, convinced he heard a faint creak above, the sound of a board shifting beneath invisible steps. He held his breath, listening. The house was empty. He knew it was empty. Yet the sound came again, soft and deliberate. He gripped the portrait with one hand, his flashlight with the other, and turned slowly toward the cellar door once more. The darkness below seemed to pulse, waiting. A thought clawed into his mind, chilling him more than the damp air, more than the scratches on stone or the bone in the dirt. What if he never left this house at all? The glow of Elias's desk lamp carved a lonely circle of light in the dark study. The rest of the room swallowed in shadows. Stacks of census records, brittle property deeds, and yellowed newspapers were spread across the table like a battlefield of paper. His hands trembled as he shuffled through them, eyes bloodshot from nights without sleep. The portrait of the Whitlock family sat propped against a stack of books, its glassy surface catching the light. That faint blur in the corner of the photograph, once dismissed as nothing, now pulled at him like a silent voice demanding to be heard. He leaned closer, whispering to himself, "There's someone there. I know it." Every lead he followed brought him back to one name, Simon Keating. The records described him simply, laborer, 26 years old, unmarried. But the scattered rumors Elias uncovered painted a darker picture. Men at the sawmill spoke of missing wages. One farmer claimed Simon had argued with the Whitlocks in town. And then, one newspaper clipping, tucked between advertisements for patent medicines and farm auctions, froze Elias in his seat. Local worker vanishes without trace. Family denies involvement. The date was 1889, the very year etched on the portrait's frame. Elias set the clipping beside the portrait. His chest tightened as his mind connected the two. Simon Keating had disappeared the same week the Whitlock family gathered for their photograph. He pushed his chair back and moved to his computer, sliding the photograph beneath a scanner. The machine whirred, pulling the image into digital form. He adjusted contrast, sharpened edges, and leaned forward as the blur began to resolve. Slowly, the smudge in the corner became more than a trick of exposure. Cheekbones, hollow eyes, a mouth frozen open, twisted between terror and defiance. Elias's breath caught. He whispered the name aloud as if testing it against the image. Simon. The room felt suddenly colder. The face in the glass wasn't incidental. It wasn't a mistake of light. It looked trapped, like a final breath caught in silver nitrate. Elias rubbed his arms against the chill crawling over his skin. And that was when the dreams began. Night after night, Elias woke drenched in sweat. He dreamed of narrow stone walls, of fingernails scratching until they broke, of muffled cries swallowed by earth. The sound of pounding fists against wood rattled in his skull, even after he opened his eyes. He told himself it was exhaustion, but deep down he felt something else. The portrait was reaching out. Simon's spirit wanted him to see. The next morning, Elias stood at the rusting gates of the Whitlock estate, the portrait wrapped carefully under his arm. Daniel, his oldest friend, shifted uneasily beside him. "Are you sure about this?" Daniel asked, his voice low. His gaze lingered on the broken windows and sagging roofline. "We've been through this place before. If you dig too deep, you won't like what you find." Elias gave a tight smile. "That's exactly why I have to." Inside, the house smelled of rot and damp earth. Dust stirred in the air as they stepped across warped floorboards. Elias's flashlight beam swept over peeling wallpaper and broken furniture, but he moved with purpose, following a memory from his dream. The cellar. He led Daniel down creaking stairs, their footsteps echoing in the hollow space. The beam of light revealed crumbling stone walls and rusted shelves. For a long time, they found nothing. Elias's hands shook as he pressed along the walls, searching for something, anything, that matched the feeling gnawing at him. Then his fingers caught a hollow sound against the boards. He exchanged a look with Daniel. Together they pried back the rotted wood. Behind it, wrapped in mildew-stained canvas, was a book. Elias lifted it free, coughing as dust billowed around them. A ledger. Its cover was warped, the ink faded, but the entries inside were chillingly precise. Names, dates, amounts of money. Elias flipped page after page until his stomach clenched. There it was, Simon Keating. And next to his name, written in hurried scrawl, silenced, buried. Elias stared at the words until they blurred. Daniel put a hand on his shoulder. "This is enough. You've got what you need. Let the authorities handle it." But Elias couldn't pull his eyes from the page. His voice was barely a whisper. "No, it's not enough. This came to me for a reason. The portrait, the dreams, it's like he chose me. I can't just walk away. Daniel's jaw tightened. You're chasing ghosts. Elias turned to him, his expression raw with determination. Exactly. And if I don't give him a voice now, then Simon stays nothing more than a rumor. That ledger means someone silenced him. But he's not silent anymore. For a long moment Daniel said nothing. He only watched Elias with an expression caught between fear and pity. They left the estate as the last light of dusk painted the sky in bruised shades of purple. Elias carried the portrait under one arm and the ledger in the other, both heavier than they looked. At the edge of the overgrown drive, he paused and turned back. The house loomed in shadow, its windows like hollow eyes watching him leave. A chill threaded down his spine, and he almost told himself it was nothing. But then he saw it. In the second-floor window, pale and motionless, a face stared down at him. Gaunt features, hollow eyes, skin like wax stretched thin. His body froze, his breath trapped in his throat. Daniel followed his gaze but frowned at the emptiness. "What are you looking at?" Elias's voice was barely audible, his lips trembling as the truth pressed itself against his chest, like a weight he could no longer deny. "He knows I can see him." The room was silent except for the muffled creak of boots against the warped floorboards. A pair of deputies moved slowly through the Whitlock cellar, their gloved hands sweeping dust and loose soil aside as the forensics team crouched nearby. The faint hum of fluorescent lamps overhead cast a harsh clinical glow across the damp stone walls. Elias stood near the doorway, his coat buttoned tight despite the stagnant heat underground. His heart pounded with every sound of shovel against earth. Then came the hollow clink. One of the officers froze, his shovel's edge catching something solid beneath the loose dirt. A few tense seconds passed before the others crouched down, scraping carefully until fragments emerged, curved, brittle, unmistakable. Bones. Human. Elias felt his throat tighten. He forced himself to step closer, his breath shallow as the coroner whispered, "Confirmed. Multiple remains." The words carried like a judgment through the cellar. The truth he had pursued for weeks was no longer speculation. Simon Keating had been buried here, murdered, hidden beneath the feet of the Whitlock family for more than a century. By evening, the house swarmed with activity. Evidence bags lined the hallway, the sound of cameras clicking as photographs recorded every cruel detail. Officers carried out the rotting ledger Elias had unearthed earlier, its pages brittle but damning, listing debts and punishments like entries in a business account. Each number and note was another stone pressing down on the Whitlock legacy. The town of Blackridge stirred restlessly as news spread. Reporters set up outside the gates, their vans casting long shadows under the street lamps. Neighbors whispered on porches, voices hushed but eager, their curiosity tinged with unease. For them, the Whitlocks had always been a proud name carved deep into Blackridge's history. Now that name crumbled under the weight of the earth pulled from their own cellar. Elias stayed late at the coroner's office, drawn by a grim compulsion. He stood at the edge of the sterile room as Dr. Harland, the county coroner, leaned over the table. Simon's remains were arranged with care, each fracture labeled. "See here," Harlan murmured, pointing with a gloved finger. "Not accidents, not hard labor. These breaks, they're deliberate. Arms twisted, ribs crushed. Someone made sure he couldn't escape." The words struck Elias harder than he expected. He felt his stomach knot. For weeks he had lived with Simon's faint image staring back from the old photograph, the outline of a face pressed into glass by some unknown alchemy of time and chemicals. That reflection had always seemed full of fear, as though the man himself had whispered through the century. Now, standing over the broken bones, Elias realized that fear had been earned in his final hours. But the strangest part lingered in his mind. The reflection in the portrait had not faded. Even after preservation techniques and exposure to light, Simon's image clung to the glass, and sometimes, though Elias had never admitted it aloud, the expression shifted. He had seen it himself, less terrified now, more alert, almost alive. The Whitlock descendants, men in pressed suits and stiff collars, arrived in the days that followed. Their faces flushed with anger as they stood before the courthouse, dismissing the findings as a distortion of history. One of them, a sharp-eyed businessman named Charles Whitlock, addressed the press with a strained smile. "My family has lived in this town for generations. These claims, this so-called evidence, it's slander against the Whitlock name. An attempt to rewrite history for attention." But his voice cracked under the clicking storm of cameras, and when Elias stepped forward holding the ledger, the reporters swarmed him instead. He lifted the book carefully, his hand steady despite the pounding in his chest. "This is not hearsay," Elias said firmly, his voice echoing through the marble steps of the courthouse. "This is the handwriting of your ancestors. And this," he raised the photograph, the glass glinting in the afternoon sun, "is Simon Keating, a man whose story was buried beneath your house. He deserves to be remembered for the life he lived, not the silence forced upon him." The crowd leaned in, microphones thrust forward. Charles's face drained of color. The legacy of the Whitlocks fractured in public, collapsing beneath evidence no words could repair. Days later, Elias stood before a hall of students at the local university. The lecture hall was dim, except for the glow of the projector behind him. Young men filled the rows, leaning forward in their seats, as Elias held the portrait aloft. "This image," he explained, voice steady though his palms were damp, "is more than photography. It is testimony. Time has preserved not just a face, but a witness. Simon Keating endured cruelty that history sought to erase. This photograph refuses that erasure. It forces us to see." The room was still. Even the usual hum of shifting papers and coughs had vanished. When Elias placed the portrait on the podium, the sound of cameras clicking rose softly, capturing the moment, ensuring Simon's name would echo beyond this single night. Later, the quiet returned. Elias walked alone into his office, the weight of the day still pressing his shoulders. He set his coat on the chair and carried the portrait to his desk. The lamplight reflected off the glass as he sat down, staring at the faint face within. For the first time, Simon's features seemed calm. The desperate strain that had haunted Elias in every previous glance was gone. His eyes looked steady, almost serene, as if the long wait had ended. Elias felt the air shift, a stillness settling over the room so complete that even the clock on the wall seemed to hesitate. He whispered to himself, though the words were meant for the man in the glass. "You weren't asking for revenge, were you?" His voice trembled. "You only wanted someone to speak." The silence deepened. A sense of release hung in the air, subtle yet undeniable. And then, as the clock struck midnight, the reflection dimmed. The faint outline faded slowly, dissolving into nothing until the glass showed only what it was. An empty surface, the captured image gone. Elias leaned back in his chair, staring at the absence. He felt his chest tighten, not with fear, but with an ache he couldn't quite name. Simon Keating was free. Elias lowered his head, whispering into the quiet, "At last, he's free."